This is a production of Cornell University.
My name is Nick Vanderwall. I'm a professor in the government department, and I'm the facilitator of the Foreign Policy Initiative at the Einaudi Center. I want to welcome you all to this talk, which is one of the Einaudi Center's Distinguished Foreign Policy Speaker Series talks, and the Distinguished Speaker Series is part of the Foreign Policy Initiative, which the Center launched a couple years ago to promote the academic and diverse discussion of foreign policy issues on campus in a variety of fora. I think the Einaudi Center wants to thank, for their support of this initiative, Mr. and Mrs. Luigi Einaudi, the Kessler family, and Judy Lund Biggs. Thank all of them for their generous support to the Foreign Policy Initiative. The Distinguished Speaker Series has a great program for the rest of the spring. Let me go over very quickly what else is coming up. Next Wednesday, Martin Palouse, one of the leaders of the Velvet Revolution and currently the Czech ambassador to the UN, will be giving a talk. On April 23rd, Prince Turki Al Fazal, the former Saudi ambassador to the U.S., will be giving a talk sponsored in part by the Distinguished Speaker Series. And then also on April 27, the Einaudi Center's Bartels Fellow will be Mo Ibrahim, the founder and president of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and he'll be giving a talk on April 27th. Okay, so today it's my pleasure to welcome an old friend to Cornell, Thomas Carothers. Thomas Carothers is the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's the Director of the Democracy and Rule of Law program there, as well as the Director of the Middle East and a program in Carnegie Europe. He's the author of a number of critically acclaimed books on democracy promotion and numerous articles. Indeed, his classic essay, The End of the Transition Paradigm, in the Journal of Democracy in 2002, is perhaps the most cited article on democratization in the English language of the last decade or so. His recent publications include Democracy Promotion under Obama, Finding a Way Forward, and Stepping Back from Democratic Pessimism. He's also been a visiting faculty member at Oxford University, at the Central European University, and at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. The title of today's talk is What Future for U.S. Promotion under President Obama? Obviously a very, very timely talk. So please join me in welcoming Tom Carothers to Cornell. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here at Cornell, and I want to thank the Einaudi Center for the invitation to be here. It's my first visit to Cornell, and I've received a warm welcome, which I appreciate. My subject today is U.S. democracy promotion, or more specifically, democracy promotion under President Obama. Given that the new administration is only 6 weeks old, this is largely a prospective look rather than a look backward. But although the administration is so new, this is nevertheless, I think it's a good time to take a look at this subject and to think about it. Because every president of the last 30 years, no matter what he intended when he came to office, has ended up substantially integrating democracy concerns into his foreign policy. And although we often tend to think of democracy promotion as an idealistic preserve, an area that's kind of a nice sort of icing on the cake of American foreign policy, if possible, in fact, each of the presidents over the last 3 decades has ended up trying to integrate democracy concerns with their core security interests and security objectives. President Ronald Reagan framed his hardline policy toward the Soviet Union in terms of democracy promotion, and he viewed supporting democracy as a way of contesting the Soviet Union ideologically and trying to anchor governments friendly to the United States in the U.S. camp. This took controversial forms, ranging from his support for sometimes military-led or militaristic governments in Central America, fighting against leftist movements, and less controversial forms, at least in the United States, such as his support for solidarity in Poland and other democracy or human rights movements in Central and Eastern Europe. His administration also set up the National Endowment for Democracy and a number of other institutions and programs that formed the basis for the modern sort of organizational array of democracy assistance that exists today. After Reagan, of course, George Bush Sr. Came to office with rather strong realist inclinations, and I would say a distinct disinclination to engage in ideological crusades. It wasn't really part of his temperament or his outlook. Yet with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union on his watch, his administration actually ended up becoming deeply engaged in pro-democracy work in both the former Soviet Union and in Central and Eastern Europe. And the question of the sort of how to help the post-communist world exit successfully from communism became a central concern of his administration, and he viewed democratization as a way to do that. And therefore, he ended up seeing democratization as key to a sort of core American security objective of the late 1980s and early 1990s. Then President Bill Clinton faced the question of how to revise America's security policies to fit a post-Cold War world in which there was no Soviet Union anymore. And as he did so, he, and especially his second Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, settled on the idea of democratic enlargement as a key concept in their foreign policy. And they ended up trying to support democracy in many parts of the world. They based their idea on a kind of a loose collection of rationales that democracy was good for the United States in different ways. They believed that democracies are more peaceful with each other, and therefore promoting democracy would be pro-peace. They believe that they make better economic partners of the United States. They also believe that democracies tend to work better together on matters of mutual concern. Clinton's concept of democratic enlargement fit well with what was going on in the world in those years. The 1990s were a time of rapid democratic expansion in the world. The third wave of democracy that had gotten going in the 1970s and early 1980s was really moving quickly in the 1990s in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, parts of Asia, throughout the post-communist world. And the Clinton administration got quite involved in trying to help democracy in many parts of the world. You remember, for example, how much President Clinton and his administration were concerned with Russia and with trying to help Russia advance with democratization. They were also involved in the Balkans with political issues, but also in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the United States got involved in democracy promotion as well as in Latin America and elsewhere. Then when George Bush Jr. took office, he came in, like his father actually, with realist instincts, criticizing the Clinton administration for having been too humanitarian in its focus, too soft in its predilection for trying to promote democracy. Yet that very quickly changed. The terrorist attacks against the United States of September 2001 caused a rethinking in the Bush administration, and I would say in the Washington policy community generally, about the role of democracy promotion. And many people in the administration and in parts of the policy community outside it settled on the idea that one way or a way to undercut political extremism in the Muslim world was to promote democracy, with the idea that it was the lack of democracy in a number of Arab and other Arab societies and other parts of the Muslim world. This lack of democracy was one of the causes of the festering of political extremism. And so first with respect to the Middle East, and then in his second inaugural address, of course, George Bush Jr. put forward his global freedom agenda, which became a kind of preoccupation, as I'll argue, more rhetorical than a real one, of his administration. So in short, despite all the differences between these presidents and their administrations, the democracy theme just keeps coming up again and again. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that U.S. policy throughout the last 30 years has been some sort of shiny, pro-democratic crusade around the world. All of these administrations faced conflicting interests and conflicting goals. All of them supported a number of anti-democratic governments. Ronald Reagan may have supported democracy in Poland, but at the time there was President Mobutu in Zaire, President Suharto in Indonesia, President Mubarak in Egypt. All of these were close and warm friends of the Reagan administration. The same was true with George Bush Sr., who, after Tiananmen Square in China, was quick to reconcile America's concerns about human rights in China with its economic needs, and America came back to a friendly relationship with China, continued it with the Middle East and a number of other areas of the world that were quite autocratic. Bill Clinton, I think, did care about democracy in the world, but at the same time, his administration was also very close to autocratic regimes in the Middle East, oil-rich countries and governments in Central Asia, again, friendly relations with China, and so forth. And George Bush Jr., as I will talk about, talked big about a global freedom agenda, but his policy was often quite anti-democratic in practice. But the point is that the democracy issue cannot be avoided in American foreign policy. It's too much a part of America's self-image. I think it's too intertwined with a variety of American interests in complex but real ways. And democracy is simply too important to ignore in the world. Troubled though it is, it remains central to the aspiration and destiny of countries all over the world, whether it's Latin America, which is trying hard to break the long oscillation between authoritarianism and democracy that plagued Latin America since the early 1800s. It's true in African countries, which have been struggling to move beyond damaging decades of authoritarian rule to find better governance and better socioeconomic performance. It's true in the post-communist world, where many countries would like a consolidated democratic European identity, and so forth. And so, overloaded though his agenda is, and President Obama's agenda is about as overloaded as anybody could be, he will nevertheless, he and his foreign policy team, soon have to define an approach to democracy promotion. Because if he does not, or they do not brand themselves, in a sense, in this domain, they will find themselves branded by others who have expectations about what the United States can or should do. And as always in Washington, it's better to be ahead than behind the curve of that kind of political branding. Now, as the new president and his team go about trying to find an approach to democracy promotion, above all a way of talking about and framing this subject that makes sense given contemporary realities, they face two major challenges in doing so. One is that they have been left with a legacy on this subject by the Bush administration, which is extremely troubled and problematic in ways that I will talk about. And in addition, they have walked into a state of global politics, which is also very difficult with respect to democracy. Let me turn first to this issue of the Bush legacy. I think the basic elements of the Bush legacy on democracy promotion are fairly clear and widely understood, and so I'm not going to linger on them. I've written a fair amount about them, but let me just go over the basics, because parts of them are clear, but parts of them are actually rather complex and I think not so well understood. The clear parts are the damage that the Bush administration did to this subject, and the damage roughly falls into two categories. First, President Bush caused democracy promotion to be closely associated with the intervention in Iraq, and more generally with forcible regime change, so that when you go around the world and talk about democracy promotion, which I actually do a fair amount, what people hear when you use that term is a hypocritical and offensive cover for what they view as aggressive American political interventionism. And so this damaging association, first of all, it caused a majority of Americans to no longer believe that democracy promotion should be a priority of U.S. foreign policy, according to the Pew polls on this subject. It caused many people in Europe and other, I would say, fellow democracies to not want to be associated with the United States on this subject and to stand apart from the United States. It caused many people in the Middle East and the rest of the Muslim world to reject the American message of democracy promotion and to sort of stand apart from it, even when their own political instincts were very much pro-democratic. And it also facilitated the ability of authoritarian or semi-authoritarian governments in many parts of the world, whether it's Venezuela or Iran or Russia, to resist Western democracy promotion efforts and sell this resistance to their publics as the necessary defense against aggressive hegemonic interventionism. So there's been a tremendous negative association of this subject around the world. And the second damage is, of course, that some of the Bush administration's actions in the war on terrorism, above all the legal abuses and violations of human rights towards prisoners and detainees, not only in Guantanamo Bay and Iraq and Afghanistan, but elsewhere, badly hurt America's standing as a global symbol of democracy. I mean, just to tell one anecdote of many that would be possible, I have a vivid memory about, I can't remember when it was, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. I was in Mozambique I was doing some research actually, but they asked me to give a talk and said, well, you're a specialist on democracy promotion. Why don't you give us a talk about America's role in this subject? So I agreed to do that. And that morning I was to give the talk, and the talk was to be to a fairly large audience of sort of the political elite in Maputo. And I got up that morning and I was sitting in the hotel having breakfast, and I opened up the newspaper, and it was the day that the photos from Abu Ghraib broke in the international press. And there was a 2-page spread of, you remember just how vivid those photos were emotionally and how shocking they were. And there was a huge headline above it, and it said, "This is how America promotes democracy in the world." And I thought, well, this is going to be a fun talk this afternoon. And it was. And because I can tell you, when an American stands before a foreign audience and has democracy promotion in not only the title of the talk, but on his business card, people let you know what they think. And the Bush administration's terrible example on rights and on the rule of law encouraged other governments to take repressive measures in their own counterterrorism campaigns, whether in Malaysia or Indonesia or Egypt or elsewhere. And it also helped them laugh off American pressure on human rights. When we would criticize another government and say, you really shouldn't do this, they really did just laugh us off, saying, well, why don't you practice what you preach? Now, these damaging elements of the Bush legacy, like I say, are widely recognized. Alongside them, however, are some other elements of this legacy in this domain that are less well understood, and I think of them as misconceptions. And as I'll talk about, I see some of these misconceptions present on the sort of the surface of the water in the policy community in Washington. One of these misconceptions is the idea that the United States has been overdoing it on elections around the world, and that elections are dangerous. They're dangerous because if you have elections in unstable places, people may elect political extremists. They might elect Islamists, whom we tend to reflexively think of as political extremists, or anti-democratic populists. Or they may be dangerous because they may break down into civil conflict, as they did in Kenya, for example, last year. This idea that, oh no, the United States is equating democracy with elections is hardly a new one. I've noticed that it surfaces about every 3 to 5 years. This idea comes forward and it receives a spate of sort of media attention. And I can tell you it's a frustrating one for the Washington sort of democracy community. And there is sort of a community of people and organizations who work on this, because the reality of U.S. policy on democracy is it has many flaws, and I'm happy to talk about them. But over-focusing on elections is not one of them. In most countries where the United States is engaged in these programs, the very things that people who don't like the elections work call for, we ought to work instead on the rule of law and socioeconomic development and civic education, all these things. We're doing all those things too, or the United States is doing all those things too. And it isn't as though actually elections are the be-all and end-all. And if you just look at the simple numbers of U.S. democracy assistance, less than 20% of that assistance is related to the electoral domain. But the idea surfaces again and again for a couple of reasons. One is that elections attract attention. Journalists like elections. They make good stories. It's hard to go do an exciting story on a municipal governance program that's looking at rural areas trying to improve governance. It doesn't make a very sexy story. An election makes a good story. So the media gives a lot of attention to elections and then tends to turn around and say, why are you paying so much attention to elections? And in addition, U.S. presidents sometimes give a lot of attention to elections, usually for their own political credit-taking reasons. There's an election in Iraq in 2005, and an administration that wants to show it's succeeding on democracy in Iraq makes too much of that election and says, look, Iraq is suddenly a democracy because they had this election. That's political credit-taking. That wasn't the actual policy. In fact, the administration didn't want to have elections in Iraq. It was Ayatollah Sistani who wanted to have elections in Iraq. The United States was resisting an election in Iraq until it was forced to by the Iraqis who would not otherwise cooperate with the United States. Yet it gets sold as there's the United States again pushing elections down the throat of the world. Another misconception coming out of the Bush period, which I think also weighs on the Obama team, is the idea that, well, the Bush people made this huge push on democracy in the Middle East, and look what they got. A bunch of Islamists, getting elected. Like the Palestinian elections, Hamas got elected, and Hezbollah did well in the Lebanese 2005 elections, and so they made this big push on democracy in the Arab world, and all they got were Islamists in return. Now, there isn't enough time to go into all the complexities of Bush Middle East policy, but certainly a great deal of damage was done, but it did not come from the rather modest effort, I would say, that the Bush people made to actually push a few Arab autocratic friends to engage in democratic reform. If we leave aside the Iraq intervention, which in my view was really a security-driven idea, and was not carried out for pro-democratic reasons. When you say, what did the Bush people really do to promote democracy in the Middle East? It's a pretty modest set of things. They did talk openly and sometimes eloquently about the possibility of Arab democratization. The Bush people did push a little bit on President Mubarak of Egypt in 2004 and 5 to carry out some electoral and political reforms. And they did establish a few aid programs like the Middle East Partnership Initiative to try to nudge the Arab world a bit in this direction. But the pressure was very, very mild. The aid programs were very modest in scale. And the intimate relations that the United States government has long enjoyed with repressive regimes in the Arab world, which include very tight ties between security forces of one and the other, were never fundamentally changed or jeopardized during these years. If anything, the war on terror caused an imperative to strengthen those ties between the Egyptian security services, the Saudi security services, the Jordanian intelligence and security services, and so forth, and their U.S. counterparts. So the idea that the United States made this enormous push on democracy in the Middle East, first of all, is a fallacy. And then related to that, the idea that the only result was that Islamists did well is also very misleading and dangerous. Hamas and Hezbollah are problematic actors for a lot of reasons, but they are not actually typical of Islamist movements and parties in the Arab world, and their gains in those elections should not mean that we just live in a state of permanent fear of Arab elections, that there's going to be this nasty Islamist tide that will be bad for us. The actual experience in the last 8 years is that Islamist parties and movements in Jordan, Kuwait, Algeria, Egypt, and other countries have actually participated fairly successfully and peacefully, and the general effect has been moderation on those movements, not radicalization. Another confusion from the Bush period that is also weighing on people takes from that Middle East experience and generalizes it and says, well, the Bush people just overdid it on democracy around the world, and so we really need to pull back. We need a kind of a realist corrective, and we lost control of ourselves there, and the United States really needs to pull back on democracy. This is, I think, a particularly dangerous misconception, because if you look at the Bush record, actually leaving aside again Iraq, which was a confusing and obviously troubled episode, most of the Bush policy was quite realist in very traditional terms. Towards China and Russia, which are the two main strategic rivals and challengers of the United States, Bush policy was eminently realist, in which democracy and human rights concerns were largely put aside for the sake of economic interests and security interests. Oil became obviously a big issue with the rise of the price of oil in 2005, and the Bush administration went after friendships with energy-rich autocrats in Central Asia and Africa and the Middle East with fervor, and did not push on human rights and democracy, whether it was Azerbaijan or Angola or elsewhere. Further on the realist note, the administration tried to cast the war on terror as a kind of idealistic crusade which would involve transformative pro-democratic policies, but the reality was mostly tightening relations with traditional authoritarians. President Musharraf in Pakistan, a military dictator, was the poster child of a new war on terror policy, and it was an eminently realist policy which said that he's our friend, and as President Bush once said at a press conference, he's tight with us on the war on terror, and that's what I care about. That's a classic statement of realism. And so the notion that the Bush people were sort of wild-eyed democratic crusaders is simply belied by the record. So why do we have this impression, or why does the world have this impression? Partly it's because of Iraq. Iraq was sort of like the sun just blinding people in this decade and trying to talk rationally about foreign policy. When you go abroad and try to talk about American foreign policy, you couldn't have a rational conversation about anything because people are so angry about Iraq. And so you just argue about Iraq the whole time. And they'd say, that's your policy. You're going around invading country after country in the world. And he said, slow down. We're We're having hard enough time with the 2 that we did invade. I don't think we're about to invade 5 or 10 others. They said, well, that seems to be your policy. So Iraq really pushed it into the face of the world in a way that it was hard for people to see and realize towards Russia, China, Azerbaijan, Angola, Egypt. Most countries, we were following pretty traditional realism. And secondly, President Bush, his soaring and rather constant rhetoric on this confused people. He just talked about it so often and it seemed to mean so much to him that people took him seriously and thought, a lot of people don't follow the details of the policy, and they hear a president saying over and over again, this is my central priority, they believe him. So, in short, the Bush legacy on democracy promotion is unusually complex. You have a lot of damage that came from the association with Iraq and with the war on terror, and at the same time you have a lot of misconceptions that arose that are currently, I think, confusing people in this country about what role should this play in our policy. And when you look at the Obama team's first 6 weeks, you see them trying to react to this complex legacy. And quite commendably, they're taking some positive steps to dissociate the United States from the damaging aspects of the Bush years. Almost immediately, as soon as the administration came in, they stopped the rhetoric on Iraq. They stopped holding out Iraq as a shining example of democratic success. They no longer say that. And Iraq had the local elections right around the time there was a transition from the Bush to the Obama team, and you immediately saw that these local elections, which actually went better than most people expected, were not celebrated as a big triumph for Iraqi democracy by the Obama team. So they're toning down the rhetoric on Iraq. Secondly, they have clearly stepped away from regime change. And when Obama says, he's willing to talk to or attempt to talk to hostile regimes if they're willing to engage in constructive dialogue, it's basically walking away from a regime change policy, which also helps. And third, they've taken some serious actions to improve America's performance on human rights and the rule of law, announcing the intention to close Guantanamo Bay and actually looking seriously at all of the legal wrongs that were done and trying to find a path towards repairing that damage. All of these steps I think of as useful parts of a process of what I would call dissociation, or more harshly as I sometimes call it, decontamination. At the same time, however, you can also see evidence that they've been a bit caught up in some of the misconceptions from the Bush years. And one is, I think, both President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton do have this idea the United States has been overdoing it on elections. And President Obama said it when he met with the Washington Post editorial board, and he was asked about his policy on democracy, and he says we have to be careful about not overemphasizing elections. I think he personally was struck by the experience in Kenya, and because of his ties to Kenya, he was very depressed and discouraged by the events in Kenya of early 2008, and that put him in some ways into the frame of mind of thinking maybe we should back away on elections a bit. The new team has also been fairly silent on Middle East democracy. When President Obama gave a talk gave an interview with Al Arabiya television in the Middle East, he never mentioned democracy in the Middle East, or he never mentioned the concept of Arab democratization. And that was striking to people in the Arab world who were quite curious whether he was going to come back to this theme in some way. And in general, President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton have just stayed quiet on the subject of democracy support around the world. In his inaugural address, there was no mention of that, which is actually somewhat unusual. And the American presidents tend to have a rather ritualistic adoption of rhetoric in this regard. Secretary of State Clinton, in her confirmation hearings, which are quite extensive and with all written answers and testimony, never once mentioned democracy support in any way. Now, before I say a bit more about the Obama approach, let me mention the other challenge. I said there are two challenges. One was the Bush legacy, which I've talked in detail is really difficult. The other challenge is the global state of politics. And it's sort of as if it wasn't bad enough the legacy you've been handed, look at the global situation you've also been handed. In some ways, because a lot of people have been so focused on the difficulties of the Bush period and sort of Bush actions during the last 5 years, they haven't paid so much attention to the actual underlying politics in the world. To the extent that they have, there's been a lot of talk in the last 3 or 4 years about, basically the concept has been democracy is in trouble in the world and authoritarianism is on the march. As you know, there's a kind of tendency towards a certain kind of black or white in American policy analysis. Either things are going really well or they're going terribly. Well, we've shifted from democracies taking over the world in the 1990s to democracies failing around the world. And you look around and people say, look at the evidence. China is on the rise and the China model is popular everywhere. Russia, at least until the financial crisis hit it, is on the rise. And there's a thing called authoritarian capitalism that's gaining people's minds and hearts. There have been coups in Thailand and Bangladesh and Mauritania, and democracies are rolling backwards. Kenya broke down into electoral violence. Zimbabwe is a mess on democracy. Elections in South America have produced these dubious leaders who seem to want to take apart constitutional checks and balances and so forth. So there's this sort of apparent bad news about democracy in the world. And it produces the impression that this decade has been a very damaging one for democracy. Actually, I tend to be in life on the side of the skeptics and the pessimists, but in this case, I'm not, because I think people are overreading certain pieces of evidence and overstating this. And because partly is the good news on democracy tends to be less interesting and grab less attention than bad news. So, for example, yes, Ecuador and Bolivia are engaged in processes politically that may be dangerous for democracy, but does anybody talk about Paraguay has made the most important advances for democracy in the last 30 years of its history? It just doesn't get much news. It's just not a good story. Indonesia, the largest in population terms Muslim society in the world, has made tremendous advances in democracy in the last 10 years. It's not blemish-free, but Indonesia is much more democratic today than it was 15 years ago, and is really a truly heartening example of a society with a highly diverse population, with a lot of economic problems, making very good democratic progress. Again, doesn't make the headlines. Yes, Bangladesh had a coup, which was damaging, but the military actually gave back power to the civilians and said, we actually do not want to run the country. Let's try it again. And they're going back to democratic politics in some ways. And just in simple statistical terms, if you look at the number, and these statistics, Freedom House scores have their flaws, but basically there's a certain value in saying if you look at the number of democracies today, it's actually there are 89 today, whereas 10 years ago there were 86. And the number of autocracies has shrunk from 46 to 42, or 48 to 42. So actually, this decade has seen an expansion of democracy in the world, not a retraction of democracy. And so the basic picture is modest expansion, but basically continuity and a fair amount of stagnation. Because I think what's troubling is democracy in retreat or is democracy advancing, is that there's basically a loss of momentum. This third wave of democracy that started in the mid-'70s in Southern Europe, reached through the 80s and through the 1990s, has basically stopped. And we're now in it's sort of like the engine turned off and the car is still moving, but there's very little pro-democratic momentum in the world. It's very hard to find many countries that are moving forward on democracy, other than a couple of good news cases that I mentioned, but most countries are kind of stuck in one form or another politically. And when democracy promoters go out into the world and try to work in countries now, they're really faced with a couple of different sort of situations, which are very different from the kind of positive transitions they were engaged in the 90s. They either are working in authoritarian countries like Russia that are actively resisting Western democracy promoters, saying, we do not want this on our territory, we don't like you here, go away, which is obviously difficult. Or they're working in sort of semi-authoritarian regimes that have some elections and have some political parties and a bit of civil society, but the government really has a stranglehold on the political system and doesn't allow any alternation of power, like Egypt or Kazakhstan or a number of other places, and says, sure, you can come to your democracy assistance, but we know how to play the reform game. We'll have elections, but we know how to control elections, or we can have a bit of civil society. And a number of governments have gotten very adept at playing the reform game. Or there are countries that have adopted democratic forms, but seem to have trouble developing the actual democratic substance. And you go and citizens are very frustrated by that. And they say, we have a democratic government, but it's not really producing anything in our country. A number of Latin American countries are in that situation. And so what's happened is we've gone from a world in which we used to be in the democracy sort of world kind of rolling boulders down the hill. You go to a country like South Africa in the early 1990s, they're about to have an exciting election, and the society was in a sort of sense of dynamism and optimism, and you'd come and do a civil society program, and there was a sense of you were pushing on an open door or rolling boulders down the hill. And that was true in 50 to 100 countries around the world. That's gone. When you go back to those societies today, the doors are partially closed, the boulders are sitting there at the base of hills rather than at the top, and this whole idea about going and facilitating democratic transitions is much harder today in many ways. than it was 10 or 20 years ago. That's the global landscape, one lacking democratic momentum that the Obama administration is inheriting. Add to that the global economic crisis. Now, a lot of people are saying, what's going to be the political effect of the global economic crisis on the world? It's hard to tell. It's probably not going to be good. It's probably going to be mixed. A lot of, it's hard not to open the newspaper these days without a story saying some country, whether it's Ukraine or Latvia or Hungary, is under stress and the government is falling because of bad economic situation. So there's a lot of troubling news about governments under pressure. At the same time, though, a lot of authoritarian governments are also under pressure because of the global economic crisis. I was just in Egypt a couple of weeks ago, and in Cairo, I was meeting with people in the Egyptian government. They've been depending upon 6 or 7% growth to keep the population from really getting angry about their mismanagement of the country over the last 30 years. And when they look ahead at 0% growth for the next 3 to 5 years, they're very scared politically about what they face, particularly because their president is old and probably going to give way soon. And so authoritarian countries are as scared as democratic ones. And the question will really be, the economic crisis will hit democratic governments in some ways differently than authoritarian ones for different reasons. But I think we can be fairly confident that the economic crisis is not going to produce political stability or happiness or contentment anywhere in the world. And so that adds to this general sense that the Obama people are coming into a very problematic situation in this regard. So let's return then and finish up with what the Obama administration's task is then. Both these daunting challenges, the problematic Bush legacy, the difficult state in the world, create pressure on the new team to pull back on democracy. And you can see, and I know when I talk to people in the administration, they're sort of, this subject is very troubled. It's radioactive because of Bush. It's dark and scary because of the way the world is. Let's just go do something else. That sort of is the feeling. Let's talk about something else. And that's where I think some danger lies, is I think it's important to dissociate from the problems of the Bush years, but it's important to dissociate without giving up. And that's the sort of middle ground, which I think is important to find. Because the process of repair and recovery from the Bush years is something that will take time. As you know, from any aspect of life, when you incur reputational damage, whether it's your personal reputation, or institutional reputation, or national reputation, it occurs in minutes and it takes years to overcome. Ask any politician who's been tainted by a scandal. And it's the same with our country. Reputational damage that our country has suffered in many ways in the last 5 to 7 years will take a long time to overcome. But as I mentioned, they have started down that road with some measures of repair. But what is also needed, in addition to repair and recovery, is some kind of positive vision in which this country can once again say to the world, we've absorbed some of the negative lessons of the past, but we'd like to return to this subject. We're not going to give up on this. And I think that the way to do that is not by trying to find some new security rationale or to keep pushing on the idea that the way we're going to undercut political extremism in the world is through democracy. That idea just didn't persuade many people in the world. First of all, it looks very selfish. If you go to a country and they say, and you're trying to work on democracy programs and work with people, and they say, why are you really here? If your answer is, because I'm afraid that if we don't come here and work with you, you're going to come and kill us, because you're going to be politically radical, it's not a very good message to send, I can tell you. It doesn't sort of build partnerships with other societies. You have to send a more positive, and it's also intellectually flawed, in that it's an appealing idea that the reason people are politically extreme or radical or anti-Western is because they don't have democracies, but it's just not that simple. It was an oversimple idea for a very scary and difficult problem. It's enough if you look at Spain, for example. Spain has had a problem with political radicalism in the last 40 years, which is called Basque separatism, which leads to terrorism in the case of Spain. When Spain became a democracy in 1975, the problem of Basque radicalism and extremism has not gone away. Spain is a highly inclusive political system, which has sophisticated possibilities for different groups, federally and nationally and locally, to participate, but the Basque extremists are still there. They're still setting off bombs. And so Spanish democracy did not solve the problem of political extremism in Spain. It's just not that simple. Political extremism has its own genesis, often an intellectual genesis, sometimes a territorial one, and it has lots of different solutions, but simply democracy as a solution is not necessarily one of them. So I think we need to sort of move away from that idea because I don't think it's very persuasive. I think we fall back on what sound like banalities in some ways, but are basically true, and we have to be comfortable with democracy and say that basically as a society we are more comfortable, we are better off, and we are relatively safer in a world populated by democracies than dictatorships. That democratic habits of participation and pluralism and openness tend to produce, not always, and one can pile on the qualifications, but tend to produce governments that are more peaceful, treat their own citizens better, treat their neighbors better, make better global citizens, and act more responsibly, in a sense, internally, externally, towards an international environment that's favorable for the United States and other established democracies in the world. So I don't think we should agonize a lot about whether democracy is good or bad for us. Instead, I think we should focus more on what is the message about us and how we're going to go about doing this, because it's really been the how, not the what, that has been bothering people. When I've gone before foreign audiences so many times in this decade, what's really bothering people is the how. It's the in-your-face, it's the aggressiveness, it's the not listening, it's the hubris, the hegemony, and so forth. And a new rationale and spirit actually is available to us. And I think fortunately it's available in the political philosophy and political style of President Obama. It's as though you look around and say, where's the answer? And it turns out it's right here at home. Because President Obama does have realist instincts in the sense that I think he's very prudential about the American role in the world. And unlike some other American presidents, I think he really accepts the idea of limits of American power. And having lived in foreign cultures and experienced them firsthand a bit more than some previous presidents, I think he has an instinctive understanding that America is only one society of many and not sort of primary answer to the world. Yet at the same time, realist though he may be in certain ways, he actually embodies a very positive pro-democracy message, because his own personal story, which is a rather remarkable journey, I view it as a search for identity and a search for meaning in which he tries to find it through his own self-empowerment and then integrating that empowerment into the empowerment of community and larger national society. It's not just inspirational, but it's very much a story of grassroots democratization that works well with what democratization can mean for other societies. And in addition, the story of his election, which is the story of American democracy finally at its most participatory and open best, is one that has captured the global imagination as well. And if you add still further to that, a few basic elements of President Obama's style also fit very well with a pro-democracy message. He has a very calm and measured tone, even at a time of national crisis. That's the tone people around the world would like to hear the United States speak about democracy, and not exultant and aggressive and overly enthusiastic. In addition, he has an instinct towards bipartisanship rather than lone crusades, which is crucial for this subject that used to be rather bipartisan but kind of lost it. And finally, he also, when he said that it really isn't so important whether the government is large or small, but whether the government works, that's the dilemma that many new democracies are facing. Ideological debates in many societies are uninteresting to citizens. Citizens want a government to work. They really could care less about what the ideology of it is. They want performance. They want to see their government solve some of their problems. And when he says a message like that, rather than government is the problem rather than solution, he's talking a language that people around the world can relate to and can understand. And so, given that this has been, I think, actually a great democratic moment for the United States, it would be odd, and I think it would also be a tremendous missed opportunity, not to connect that moment at home to our foreign policy abroad, to turn inward or away on democracy finally at the moment we're at our most appealing and persuasive to the world. And so, I think a new spirit or style regarding democracy promotion, one that emphasizes quiet persistence, bipartisanship, making the government work, empowerment, and a certain sobriety mixed with inspiration, is the right framework by which we can then go out in the world quietly and modestly but seriously and talk to other governments and other societies and say, we do care about this. We are willing to be a partner. And so when the administration, for example, rebuilds some U.S. credibility in the Middle East, which it could over time, then we can return to Arab societies and Arab leaders and opinion makers and say, we really do care about this issue. Not because you're afraid you're going to come kill us, but because we care about this issue. Look at what we're trying to do in our own society. We believe in this. We act on it. we think we could share this with you in terms of what we have learned, and you could share with us what you're trying to do. Or if the administration turns to Latin America, it will find a region which has sort of been, in a sense, angry at and feeling ignored by the United States for some time. It will find a region very worried about its political stability in the economic crisis and quite willing to view the United States at least as a potential partner in solving some of these problems if the United States is willing to talk and act as a partner of serious purpose. And we could go so forth around the world, because in every part of the world where President Obama goes, he and his team are, at least for a time, a walking symbol of the value and power of democracy. And in a world unsettled by economic crisis and unsettled by a difficult decade in many fronts, this message will carry some weight. And the Obama team needs to be ready to apply that weight in a number of areas that are coming up on the screen. You look ahead in the decade ahead, there will almost certainly be a leadership succession in Egypt. A society which has been politically frozen for 30 years is about to come unfrozen. That's a time at which a society in which actually the United States does have some potential influence. If we begin to talk calmly and coherently now about the possibility of Egyptian democracy, we could play a useful role. Ukraine, for example, is struggling hard to stay on track with political changes they initiated in the Orange Revolution and before. They need the sense of a calm and consistent and serious friend in that process. I could go on. The point is that, to sum up, that the Obama administration, as I mentioned, cannot afford to avoid defining itself on democracy. The United States has no choice. It has positioned itself in the world's imagination, like it or not, as a country to which people want to argue about its role in democracy in the world. And it does face a very difficult legacy because of the Bush years and a very difficult global political situation. So we need to move ahead quietly, modestly, but we need a positive framework for doing so. But as I mentioned, I think such a framework is actually not far from hand. And if this administration, in a sense, takes its own character, weaves it into its own foreign policy, then I think we will have at least the start of a path forward. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments. Sure, I'll just go on. Yeah, sure, no problem. I really encourage you to ask any or anything, and as I mentioned at a talk I gave at lunch today, I really like skeptical and challenging questions, so please don't be shy if you have something where you'd like to disagree with me or anything else, so please dive in. Yes, please.
My question, I would have two parts. The first part would be, what would be the substance of the democracy promotion agenda you would see in the future? Because besides the style that you were talking about, I'm wondering what kind of focus should be. I mean, in particular, I would be interested in your take on the argument of Pippa Norris in her recent book on driving democracy in terms of the institutional focus, which she very much looks at, and kind of consensus-based institutional arrangement as the most promising type of democracies to be promoted. And my second question would be, how do you see the interrelationship with democracy promotion from the European Union or the European side, which has been quite different, and how do you see that interrelationship functioning in tandem or rather in competition with each other?
Great, thank you. Well, with respect to the substance, I think that I'm basically a believer that we've ended up at a place 25 or 30 years into this expansion of democracy in the world where I think the idea of the basic transition sort of continuum has faded away, and countries are in a whole series of different states. I mean, to me, the fact that in kind of American political science, the most popular term of the last 5 or 6 years for describing political regimes out there is sort of hybrid. And to me, hybrid means, I don't know what the hell it is. So let's call it hybrid. I'm not a political scientist, so I can say that. I mean, actually, I think it's a useful term in some ways because I don't think we know what the hell a lot of these regimes are, to put it politely. And so I think that what we have learned in terms of the substance of how we go about promoting democracy is that part of the reason, I think the value of what Pippa Norris has written about in institutional design is we realize that in many cases, countries made basic institutional decisions, then dived into transitions and ended up 10 or 20 years in it with really deep structural problems about their institutional arrangements that caused them to fail again and again. And we missed a moment because in some ways we weren't intellectually prepared to understand about different institutional arrangements at the time that they made those choices. So I agree that in some cases it's very useful to go back, particularly on electoral systems, for example, and talk about different sort of choices that countries make. The problem is, of course, is once a country is 10 or 20 years into a set of constitutional arrangements about the structures of power, the vested interests are strong, and people intellectually may be willing to talk about choices, but the power holders don't want to really make choices. And so we've learned a lot about institutional design, but we've also learned it's hard to go back to a blank slate and undo that. But I think we now have the tools to examine situations and say, I think I understand what the problem is here. In this case, it tends to be this or that, which we actually didn't really have when we were in more of a hurry. So I think our programs have to move away from what I have tended to call sort of endpoint analysis, where you simply define an endpoint and say, this country doesn't resemble that endpoint, and so I'm going to train the people in the country until they act in conformance with that endpoint. And so we have moved towards a sort of more process-oriented view in which we think what we really want to do is encourage the different actors in society to work together in different ways to reach better processes and outcomes. So all of that is to say that I think it's kind of an argument for informed eclecticism, that we need to not come in with standard approaches. And what we need to do is to mix better diplomatic support in certain situations with more informed and sophisticated assistance. Democracy assistance has actually gotten somewhat more sophisticated over the last 10 or 20 years, but it's been fairly starved. I mean, USAID, which remains the largest source of U.S. democracy assistance, is an undernourished and neglected federal agency that has been pretty badly treated by a number of administrations. I think the key is actually supporting those kind of institutions in serious ways that will allow them to get the quality of the people and the flexibility that they need and so forth. Then I think they will be able to figure out better substance. So I don't want to prescribe and say we ought to do it this way in Ukraine and that way in Guatemala. Is we've learned some things, let's actually make our institutions reflect that learning and be more sophisticated. And so, for example, there's a move to rewrite the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. It's about 40 years overdue, that move, and that's an example of we are able to do this intelligently. Howard Berman, who's the chair of the House International Affairs Committee, is determined to rewrite the Foreign Assistance Act. That's an opportunity to give the foreign assistance mechanisms the flexibility to do this work better. With respect to Europe, I just published an article in the Journal of Democracy last month called The Political versus Developmental Approaches to Democracy Assistance, in which I tried to analyze some of the roots of the differences between European democracy thinking and assistance and U.S. And I argue that Europeans do tend to think about it in a more developmental way than many Americans do, trying to integrate socioeconomic development with political development and less focused on sort of political action and political dynamics like Americans. So I think there are actually deep differences in European and American traditions about democracy that have led Europeans down a slightly different path. That's been compounded by the fact that in the last 8 years, a lot of Europeans just want to stay several arms length away from American institutions and not be associated with them, especially in the Middle East, but elsewhere. I actually think it's a new moment now in which it's possible to get together with European counterparts and talk about sort of cooperation and communication and sharing and reopen some doors that have been closed. I've been sponsoring some meetings at Carnegie, just had one last week, inviting Europeans to come and talk about their methods of democracy assistance promotion. And they're actually eager to come to Washington. They feel that they're being listened to for the first time in a long time. So I think actually it could be a productive period in which we start to work again with kind of natural partners and allies in this. Just to finish on that, I mean, one of, to me, the most damaging things about how the Bush administration approached this, and the president in particular, was the aloneness of the task. When you listen to the second inaugural address in 2005, in which President Bush set out this some ways stirring vision of the United States as a supporter of freedom around the world, I pictured it as this sort of lone eagle over this desert world infested with these rats of tyranny, in which we were the only sort of force in the world on the side of tyranny. Whereas, there are 30 to 50 governments in the world that in different ways support democracy and human rights, and there are lots of international institutions that do. There are tons of NGOs that do. We're not the lone power. And if anything, we're one of a flock of things. And he missed that imagery so badly that many people in the world are sort of puzzled as, why do you keep putting yourself so alone on this when you're not? That needs to change. I think, yes, right there.
Some years ago, Noam Chomsky said during the time of the Contra-Sandinista problems, he said that, when the farmers over there want to do subsistence farming, we call that communism, and we want to get rid of it. Now, Obama is veering toward a better cultural exchange toward Cuba and America. Do you think that, will that be extended, if he does get that foot in the door, will this be extended to business? My idea is that businessmen don't care about ideology, they want to make a buck. And if they do make a buck and raise the poverty level of the Cubans, raise that to where they're not poverty-stricken, will that eliminate the political oppression, since now they're successful? But it would be a communist government. Will we allow that? Will we go that far?
Well, what's interesting is that's precisely what we think we're doing in China. Is that there's an underlying belief in the China community in the U.S. policy circles that if we continue to trade with China and facilitate their economic development, they're going to hit a level of income and wealth that they're going to make a Taiwan or South Korea-like transition to democracy. It's odd that we're willing to do that with China, but then when it comes to Cuba, we have to starve them to death. That's part of the charm of American politics, that we're able to proceed into completely conflicting ideas at the same time and explain it to the world as making perfect sense. The Obama administration has a big opportunity to change one of the most dysfunctional policies we have, which is our policy towards Cuba. U.S. policy towards Cuba over the last 50 years has helped keep in place what is now one of the longest-serving dictatorial regimes in the world, which is the Castro regime, which has been in power since 1959, unlike almost any other authoritarian regime in the world, partly in thanks to U.S. policy. It still remains difficult to do that politically because there's still a lot of difference of agreement. Just today, you may have read the story in the New York Times in which the Obama administration has actually tried to quietly sneak into a very large and complicated economic stimulus bill and a budget 2 measures to allow Americans to spend money in Cuba without facing all these draconian restrictions and certain travel restrictions. They sort of tried to sneak those in, and of course Senator Mel Martinez from Florida saw those and stood on the floor of the Senate and denounced the Obama administration for giving in to dictatorship in Cuba. We're still stuck on this debate. And the Obama people are facing a choice of how much political capital do they want to spend to do this. I think, from what I understand, is they know in their heart of hearts this is a failed policy. Probably the best thing we could do would be to lift our sanctions against Cuba, whether in return for certain actions or not, but to enjoy an active and fruitful economic relationship with Cuba, which, as you say, would be helping, in a sense, in the short to medium term, people who are economic actors under a socialist or communist system, but would probably have the effect over time in Cuba of lifting all the boats and helping the country move to join the modern world politically and socially in other ways. So I regret it. I would like to see the administration move more in this direction, but political realism dictates they have to do it slowly, and they're going to get a lot of political flack for even small steps that they will take. Yes. There was I saw another hand over here, but it went down. Yes, you had. No.
My question was more retrospective about Bush administration. I mean, you seem skeptical that the Bush administration had any true desire to spread democracy, but if you look at the national security strategy in the United States, 2002 and then 2006, I mean, it's in your face. So I guess the question is, why would that be in there if they weren't actually seeing that as an important part of U.S. national security strategy?
It's a good question. I had an experience I can't remember when it was, 2004 or 5, I got a call from the Pentagon, and they said that a number of people wanted to come to Carnegie and meet with me, and so I went to this meeting, and there were a room full of uniformed military officers, some of them quite senior, and we sat down at the table, and the person, my counterpart, a general from the Army, opened up the national security strategy of the United States to page 1, and he says, in a kind of gravelly voice, like an airline pilot, Mr. Carothers, the national security strategy of the United States is promoting democracy on page 1. We understand you're an expert on the subject. Tell us what to do. Wow, I was like, which country do I want to invade? But I had several thoughts, actually. But you're right. it is in our national security strategy. It's also in our national intelligence strategy of the United States. And a puzzle of policy in the Bush years was they were dead serious in putting it into the security strategy because they believe very much in this idea that non-democratic or politically unstable countries are potentially damaging to American security. But they had a very hard time converting that into actual policies in actual places, because then it got to Pakistan and, well, Musharraf is our friend, he's useful to us on counterterrorism. Hosni Mubarak's not a Democrat, but he's awfully good to us on the Palestinians. Saudi Arabia, well, we need oil. And when you went around the world, China, well, they buy our treasury bonds, and you said, where's the strategy? Where are we going to apply it? President Bush himself got very frustrated. And when he said that odd thing that he did in 2007, where he said, I'm a dissident in my own administration, that was the sign of a confused man, but it was the sign of a confused policy in which we had articulated at one level a framework that, as you say, was persuasive and significant on paper, yet the administration had a very hard time translating it into that. And President Bush himself, I think, felt frustrated as to why, if it's in my national security strategy, don't I see it on the ground in very many places? And I think that's because it actually wasn't very well thought through when it was devised as a strategy. I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in 2000, I can't remember, 5 or 6, which was called The War on Terror and Promoting Democracy, or Promoting Democracy and War on Terror, where I said, we're casting the war on terror as a freedom crusade, which is very appealing, but the reality of the war on terror is you need a lot of cooperation from governments that are not democratic. And there's a central contradiction in the war on terror between that imperative and the underlying idea of a freedom crusade. And I remember the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, Paula Dobriansky, wrote a reply to me in Foreign Affairs, and she said, there is no contradiction in our policy is unitary. And I wrote a reply and said, I know Paula for a long time. I said, Paula, that sounds good, but it's not. What about Musharraf? It's not unitary. We have a problem in Pakistan. We've got a military government that's helpful to us, and we don't seem to see an alternative. And there's a contradiction in our policy. And she just said, I'm sorry, it's unitary. And so they were stuck. They were stuck with a policy that just didn't fit together in certain ways. But you're right, they were dead serious. They used to have freedom agenda meetings among senior interagency committee, led by people in the White House or sometimes the State Department, and they called them Freedom Agenda meetings, where they would get together and talk about how they're going to implement the Freedom Agenda. But those meetings were problematic because of what I've talked about. Yeah. Yes. All the way back down. Yeah.
You made a bold claim when you said if you look beyond Hamas and Hezbollah at the wider set of Islamist movements in the Arab world, you said that as they participate in elections, they've moderated. You mentioned Algeria, Egypt, Jordan, Kuwait. I was wondering, what do you mean by moderation, and what are you basing that on? How do you know they've moderated?
Yeah, that's a good question. You're right, it's a bold assertion. Well, I believe that generally in the Arab world, since the mid-1990s, there has been a moderating trend in Islamist parties and movements since the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood in the mid-1990s began to rethink some of its basic ideologies and move in a moderating direction. And at the Carnegie Endowment, we've done a lot of work in the last 5 years on Islamist movements and parties, including an ongoing dialogue process we have with leaders and senior officials in those movements and parties. We published a paper 3 years ago called Exploring the Gray Zones, sort of analyzing the democratic values or fidelity of Islamist movement and parties. And we tried to zero in on what we think are areas where they have not really confronted their own anti-democratic tendencies and areas where they have. But we felt we did that to kind of stimulate what we saw was an ongoing process of moderation. I think by moderation there's always this, underlying idea that they're just playing a game, and once they get their hands on power, then it's all over. They're never going to let go. They're going to impose, some extreme version of Sharia and so forth, and never have another election and so forth, the kind of 1991-92 Algeria scare scenario. But it doesn't either, when you look at how these parties and movements behave when they have a little bit of power, or how they behave in terms internally about their discussions and their doctrines and so forth, you do see a moderating trend. If you take the Party of Justice and Development in Morocco, for example, you look over the last 10 years, the electoral participation by that party, having to go out and compete for elections, has tended within the party, you have softliners and hardliners. And the softliners have tended to win discussions because they say we want to go out and win parliamentary seats. And to win parliamentary seats, if we call for a total ban on alcohol and veiling of all women and imposition of Sharia in these ways, we're not going to win any parliamentary seats. And we would like our party to be appealing to more than 7% of the people. We would like to be a broader party. And, you know, once you give a party or a movement a taste for political participation and power, they tend to want more of it through the electoral process, and they tend to want to become more like an all-in party, unless they're a very narrow party in a proportional representation system that just wants their 5% of the vote and is happy with it. You have seen the effect of these parties saying, I like this electoral party, I like being a parliamentarian, I like having a free car, and I like all of this, and I want to get more of these votes. And to get more of these votes, most of the societies that are in are not hardline Islamist societies in which people want to ban alcohol totally and veil all the women and that. And so the Arab world is not at a point of Islamic extremism. There is a lot of political Islam, there's a lot of social Islam in Arab societies, but it is not the same as, you know, sort of an extreme Taliban-like Islamist version of society. So Party of Justice and Development, the Islamic Action Front in Jordan, when you look, you know, they had a minister in the 1990s, you know, representing an Islamist party. Who did they choose as that minister? What did that minister actually do? If you look at their actual political actions, they do not look like the plan for a hardline agenda, you know, that's sort of a secret plan to sort of take over power. They end up looking more like parties that want to compete, win votes, and they have more open debates within themselves. I'm not saying that there's nothing objectionable on a democratic basis in Islamist movements and parties. You can find plenty of things. But I think the trend over the last, as I say, 14 or 15 years is towards greater moderation, and banning them, repressing them, torturing them does not lead to greater moderation. Yes.
Yes, I have two questions. The first is what is happening there, that the level of economic development is decreasing in many developing countries. The people are becoming poorer and poorer. Even using Freedom House indexes, it is clear that in the past 5-10 years, the level of economic inequality is increasing in many developing countries, and yet people participated heavily in the democratic process because they had high expectations that probably this democracy was going to change their social lives, and yet within 5-10 years this has not happened. So I am wondering, then on the top of this, then you have now a large crisis of capitalism, which has been predicted by many people before today. And so I'm wondering if within this transition we have a chance to rethink two things, to rethink the state and to rethink democracy. And given the fact that both failed the people in the past 20 or 30 years of structuralism programs. And so in your study, and I'm wondering if that could be a possibility of also looking forward, that we have a chance to rethink the state and to rethink democracy.
Thanks. Well, I mean, I think it's a complicated picture. I don't think one can generalize and say in the last 10 years that people have gotten poorer in developing countries. Actually, the majority of people in the developing world have done better in the last 10 years. In China, India, Latin America had the best 5 years of economic growth in the last 50 years, in between 2004 and 2008. And so, actually, you know, more people were lifted out of poverty in the last 10 years than any other 10 years in history. So it isn't just that the developing world's getting poorer and poorer. Parts of the developing world are definitely getting poorer. Some of them are democratic, some of them are authoritarian, and there isn't a clear pattern. I mean, some democracies perform very badly economically, so do some authoritarian countries also perform very bad. So I don't think the message is that democracy has been failing. A number of governments have been failing of different ideological character. Now, I certainly agree with you that the current economic crisis calls for hard thinking and revision of assumptions about the capitalist model or the neoliberal model to the extent that it has been applied in places. And it is true that serious mistakes were made in prescriptions that were given to countries about economic deregulation and certain forms of, you know, financial behavior and others. So there's plenty of room for reconsideration in our own country and not just in the developing world. But I don't think the experience either of development in the last 10 years or of this economic crisis means that democracy itself is fundamentally flawed. I agree with you, there should always be a spirit of examining the concept of democracy, and there should never be a spirit of there's a single kind of democratic system which is best for everybody. Democracy is by its nature a very pluralistic idea which should be embodied and carried out in ways that are authentic and genuine in different places, but still faithful to certain concepts of essentially democracy, of that is the people get to choose their leader and have the right to participate sufficiently to make real choices. So I agree with the spirit of what you're saying in terms of democracy should be an open experiment, and people like me and others should always be looking ahead and trying to think about how to improve it. But I don't agree that we are in a sort of a crisis of democracy as a result of economic failure. Yes.
I was wondering if you thought it would be a good idea for the administration to send Obama on kind of a goodwill tour, globally maybe, have him give speeches for major capitals in the Middle East and Latin America, in South Asia, maybe even in China, kind of, going off of what you said, just because of just the sheer symbolism of that, maybe, inspiring, people's there to, start talking about democracy and whatnot. Something that they can do now,
Right.
trying to begin this discourse.
Yeah. One of the frustrations that I understand the president and his team are having is that he is completely absorbed by the domestic economic situation now, and he feels that his primary responsibility to the American people is to spend 80 to 90% of his time on domestic economic issues from now until sometime when it begins to look like there is a set of plans and projects and budgets and in place that are coherent and are being affected. And so it is a bit frustrating that we've managed to elect a leader who is actually of genuine interest to the rest of the world, but we can't send him abroad because we need him here. It's unfortunate. And Secretary of State Clinton is traveling a lot, partly because of that, because he's got to stay home largely. I mean, he is going to Latin America for the summit in early April, and he's going to go to Europe sometime. And so he's not as though he's homebound, but he is not getting out as much in his first year as he probably hoped he would be able to. Now, in addition, I think we have to be careful in thinking about how one uses such a remarkable asset as a president who is genuinely of interest in the world. Because in the Arab world, for example, a lot of people in different Arab societies were astonished that the United States elected Barack Obama for a variety of reasons. They saw the Bush-Cheney establishment as like a machine that was impenetrable and unconquerable, and they can't understand how a skinny guy whose middle name is Hussein beat that machine. It's just not in their software. It's not what happens in Arab societies, in their political system. So they're amazed by this, and that does give him a very special quality. On the other hand, they're deeply cynical about America's role in their region for a whole variety of reasons. And they would like to see some change in basic things, above all, of course, in America's approach to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And one has to be careful about sending President Obama abroad, or his going abroad, before he starts to undertake some measures or steps that would add substance to his image. Because you don't want an image to be just an image. You want it to be backed up by actions. And so it's kind of a tricky thing, because there's people abroad are impressed and are interested, but they're also quick to become cynical and sort of say, sure, you came and gave a nice speech, but when are you going to actually tell the Israeli government to freeze a settlement? Or, to put it in naked terms. And so I think one has to be careful about sending him on a kind of a rock star tour. He has to go when there are substantive, serious things on the table where he's already engaged in some ways and shown that he's going to have a different approach. There's been a lot of talk in Washington about, should the president go to a Muslim capital? Which capital should he go to, and what should he say? Somehow it's become a parlor game around Washington. And the general consensus is he should go to Jakarta, because it's the largest Muslim society. He lived there for a while as a child. It's a functioning democracy. And they're not that angry about Israel compared to other parts of the Muslim world, because they're as far from Israel as you can get. So the general consensus, if he's going to go somewhere, try that one for a whole variety of reasons. But even there, his team seems to be quite cautious. And, when Hillary Clinton was there recently, they said to her, when's he coming? And she said, and I'm sure she thought about it before she answered, maybe this fall. Maybe, and at earliest this fall. And so I think there are good reasons for caution in doing that, although I think the basic spirit of what I said is that he does represent a tremendous asset to our country now abroad, and needs to be, needs to be employed and used in the best ways possible. But I just think has to be done judiciously and carefully. Yes?
To what extent has the U.S. domestic policy of the last 8 years affected foreign views on U.S. democracy, such as warrantless wiretapping and so on and so forth?
Well, that's what I was talking about, the second part of the Bush legacy, the damage to America's standing as a democracy through not just to the mistreatment of detainees and torture of prisoners and things like that, but a whole series of elements of the war on terrorism that persuaded the world that the United States had taken a serious step away from its tradition of being a country that respects rights and democracy. I mean, I was at a seminar last year at Oxford where we were sitting around discussing one thing or another, and the proposition on the table, or actually it wasn't a proposition, the assumption in at least some significant part of the room was that the United States can no longer be called a democracy. You know, that was sort of a given among, now that was sort of a preserve of a certain kind of anti-American European intellectual view, which the United States, you know, on Freedom House is a 7 as opposed to a 1 now. And I, you know, actually had to raise my hand and say, you know, when you go through the Patriot Act, item by item, you know, yes, there are objectionable things, but we are actually still a democracy. You know, we still elect our leaders, there's still political, you know, is that, yes, there are restrictions and such, but you know, the FBI does not sit around in public libraries photographing every single person who comes in and out and checks out a book. And it doesn't, you know, their vision of Orwellian American got a bit carried away. But a huge amount of damage was done. Guantanamo, it was hard for people in Washington to appreciate the damage that simply the camp at Guantanamo had on the United States and the world, particularly in Europe, but around in the Arab world. Guantanamo just became a byword for, you know, American hypocrisy and bad behavior. I mean, it's just amazing the amount of damage that did. And so it was serious. In what happened in Europe, at least, I don't know about the rest of the world so much, but in Europe in this decade, all of those things ended up sort of joining up with a number of other European hesitations and a sense of difference with American culture and American society. And so the fact that we believe in the death penalty, the fact that in the United States, you know, women do not get guaranteed paid maternity leave. There's only 3 countries in the world where that's not the case. You know, the United States, Fiji, and Lesotho or something, you know. American society is unusual. You know, we have a number of aspects of American society. We don't take paid vacations very much compared to Europeans. And, you know, there's a whole series of things. Europeans started saying, how much are we really like you? You guys go to church a lot. We don't go to church in Europe anymore. That's, you know, why do you guys go to church so much? And why do you believe, you know, and Europe began to feel culturally divorced. And then when you added in Guantanamo and wiretapping, actually the French government, British government, if you want to see wiretapping, go to Britain and France, by the way, but they don't do it so publicly as the United States does. But at least publicly, our human rights problems ended up coalescing with a number of sociocultural things to lead to a fairly broad sense of divide and alienation between Europe and the United States at the societal level. On the other hand, 200,000 Germans turned out in Berlin to see Obama. You know, there's alienation, but then there's still this underneath it. It did not kill the roots of a desire to have the United States as a partner in some ways. And that was what was striking, is how it was still there despite all of the damage. It was like grass that looks totally yellow, and then one rain comes and surprisingly it's green again, you know. And so there is this opportunity as a result of these underlying sentiments and of the political change. Yes, please.
A few years ago,
pretty loud.
A few years ago, in a conference that was held in Zimbabwe, 2 colleagues, one from Tunisia and another one from Morocco, were presented the process of change, political change among the youth, students, young students, women who were freely deciding to where they were, projecting an image of protest and in search of an alternative. And if I can summarize their point, they said it was the triumphalist attitude and presentation of the West when the Berlin Wall went down. With the current economic crisis that calls for some reflection on the capitalist success that was claimed, and with what you have referred to as a sense of moderation and modesty, How do you think this could also affect some of this research for these young people in search of a model and reaction to the school system that was presented in the mono system that came out of the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Well, I don't like triumphalism in any particular form. I don't think it's a good thing. I mean, I think the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed and that the United States and Western Europe and others did pretty well from the 1940s to the 1980s doesn't mean that, history's over. It doesn't mean that we've discovered all the answers. And I think to the extent that the West came on strong in the 1990s with A, we're the only superpower left, and B, we have all of the answers economically and politically, was hubris of the times to some extent. And this current economic crisis is very sobering, indeed. Someone from the World Bank gave a talk at Carnegie a couple of weeks ago, and he had a bit of a sense of humor, sort of gallows humor, and he was talking about China, and he said, China is about as well positioned, except for maybe India, about as well positioned in the current economic crisis as you can be to survive a bad storm. Why is it so well positioned? Because they didn't do any of the things the World Bank was telling it to do in the last 10 years. They didn't liberalize their banks. They stopped saving at such a high rate. They didn't increase their domestic consumption. So he says, unfortunately, they didn't listen to us. Otherwise, they'd be in the same state we're in. And people around the world have noticed that. They've noticed we don't have the answers. They noticed we're struggling. They're struggling too. And they're a bit mystified how it is that a bunch of homeowners in Florida have destroyed their economy. It is a bit mysterious. If you're the Russian government, you think, wait a minute, this guy bought a house in Florida and can't pay his mortgage and the Russian economy collapses. I can tell you it's puzzling to people. And they're wondering what great plot has the United States cooked up yet once again to hurt Russia. So it is a cause for humility. Now, young people wearing the veil in the Arab world is a very interesting sociopolitical, sociocultural phenomenon. And, many more young people wear the veil than their parents, and many of their parents are confused too. I've talked to many sort of middle class people in the Arab world who are very secular, and their daughters, wear a complete veil and go to the fundamentalist university and go to classes after school, and there's a complex set of things that's causing people to do that. Part of it is a rejection, as you say, of a West that seems to be pushing in their face, which they don't like. Part of it is a generational feeling in their own societies of an impurity and corruption among the political class that seems to have failed them in so many ways. And this is a way of saying, I don't really agree with what's been happening in our own society, which I say are most of the Arab societies are unfortunately riddled with corruption at various levels. And part of it is it somehow seems to be cool for some reason, in ways that are hard to understand. There's a whole series of things that are going on that are producing a kind of generational change of the role of Islam in everyday life. So I don't think the global economic crisis is going to fundamentally change the position of the West in the world, but it's a good chance for us to take a breath, get past some of the hubris of the past, and come back to the world and say, we're all hurting together now. We obviously have some things to learn too.
I guess one last question?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Hi. Going back to the question on Bush's national security policy and incorporating democratic development, what do you see as the future of that relationship between security policy and development policy for the Obama administration?
A general idea did arise in this decade that not just democratization, but sort of economic development generally is going to be good for our security because failed states around the world can become locuses of instability and danger to us in different ways. And so economic development gained a security rationale in this decade. And a lot of people in the economic development community were happy about that because they were tired of trying to make the case to busy and overpressed policymakers, you ought to pay attention to economic development. Now they had a security reason to say, if you don't, we're going to have an enclave in, southern Somalia for the, Al-Qaeda activists. And so if you don't do economic development, you're going to get Al-Qaeda, basically. I think, again, that rationale was sort of overused and has intellectual problems with it because, basically because as always, it's not that simple, and you're sort of overpromising. You say, give me a bunch of money for economic development, and I'm going to solve this problem for you of, global jihad, which you're not actually, I think. I actually think it's a good thing to do economic development for lots of reasons, but I can't promise you I'm going to solve the problem of jihadist groups operating through a loose network in a number of countries trying to strike at Western targets. I'm not sure that all of the aid programs in the world are going to get at that problem, kind of. And so I think we have to be careful about sort of embracing the security rationale for economic development as opposed to saying there are a lot of good reasons to do economic development. Is a generosity as a country, and for, a whole variety of reasons. So I'm kind of actually been hesitant about that one. And the economic development community, I think, is often sort of doesn't put forward that argument too much itself, but doesn't correct people when they hear it being put in forward because they don't want to jeopardize the money. Because the Bush administration voted for the largest increases in foreign aid in decades in the United States, because of that security rationale. And the economic development community was thrilled, even though they didn't like the security policies. So, but I think with the new administration, we can back away a little bit. And, Obama's still talking about doubling foreign aid, even in this budget, which I think is a good thing to do. And I think, fortunately, he's not emphasizing quite so strongly the security rationale, although it's still out there and it's still talked about. The 3Ds framework that Hillary Clinton put forward is a derivative of that mindset, which says that defense, diplomacy, and development are all interlinked and such. I think that's sort of true in a broad sense, as long as we're not promising that, that economic development aid is, I could say, going to undercut Islamic extremism. Okay. Yeah.
Sort of, do you think that you'll be having more meetings with generals? To put it more bluntly, my question a little bit.
Yeah, once the battleship of the U.S. Pentagon gets pointed in a direction, it takes a while to change course. And they are a large, and on Monday I'm going to speak to 240 senior uniformed officers of the U.S. military to give a lecture called Democracy and Security. They're concerned about democracy and security, and I'm going to face a room full of 240 people in uniform, and they take notes. They're very diligent, not like you guys. They're applied. They're sitting there on the edge of their chair saying, "What should we do?" And it's daunting, and I worry about that a little bit. And my message, as you can imagine, is going to be cautionary and say, I'm glad the U.S. military is concerned about democracy in the world, but it's not a straight line between democratization and U.S. security. It's just, if you make that promise to yourself, you're going to be disappointed, then look for some other silver bullet. And I don't like silver bullets. They are magic bullets. They just disappoint us, and we pour all resources into one thing, and then we get frustrated and go play in another sandbox for a while. And so I'm worried about that.
It's a great place to end, so thank you very much.